Considering the first two Superman movies made over $500 million at the worldwide box office, it was absolutely no surprise that a Superman 3 would take flight. Besides, it was promised in the closing credits of Superman 2. With the success of Superman and its sequel, superhero movies were in the earliest iteration of franchise mode. In short, strong box office numbers guaranteed another movie, no matter how bad it could possibly turn out. And Superman 3 is just about as bad as it could possibly turn out, generally ranking among the worst superhero sequels ever, and a prime example of what happens to a series' reputation when things go wrong with the script, cast, and hell, even the opening credits.
How bad is it? My God, Superman, it's a nightmare.
So, let's go from Superman to Super Mean to Super Machine as we find out what the f happened to this movie. Superman 3 was announced at the 1980 Cannes Film Festival, well over a year before Superman 2 was even scheduled to hit North American theaters. It would even later be hyped at the following year's Cannes Film Festival, with banners on biplanes declaring the movie was now in production. It was determined this was a lie.
I see.
Superman 3 was far from ready to take flight. The plan for Superman 3 was for Richard Donner, who helmed Superman and Superman 2, or at least the Richard Donner cut, to write the screenplay, passing the coveted directing torch to Tom Mankiewicz, a key figure in shaping the first two Superman movies, and who was then known for co-writing Bond flicks Diamonds Are Forever, Live and Let Die, and The Man with the Golden Gun. By the end of 1980, Ilya Salkind, who along with his father Alexander was dominant in the franchise, turned in an 8-page outline. On these pages was a lot of material that would be discarded once official writers were put in place. But more on that in a moment. There was time travel and interdimensional shenanigans with Brainiac and Mr. Mxyzptlk, if that's how it's pronounced, as primary villains. There too would be Supergirl, who was set up to be found by Brainiac, taking on a sort of surrogate father role. Also on the family front, Salkind had it so Superman and Supergirl would eventually get married, either at the end of Superman 3 or sometime in the planned Superman 4. The two would develop a romance throughout Superman 3, with Salkind going out of the way to ensure fans that their canon relationship as cousins was not in play in the movie, lest there be some sort of Luke-Leia situation. As for what Brainiac and Mxyzptlk would be up to, one sequence would find Superman and Brainiac dueling it out as knights on horses, while sometime after that, Mxyzptlk would betray Superman after a temporary truce and challenge him to do a puzzle, okay? To top it off, he was designed to be played by Dudley Moore.
God, that's funny.
Ultimately, Warner Brothers thought there were too many minor characters from the Superman comics, and so this script was basically gutted, although some elements do remain, like the good versus evil Superman scene. Here, Superman faces off against another version of himself in a scrapyard. Interestingly enough, the movie was actually originally titled Superman vs. Superman, but this was ditched because it was too similar to 1979 Best Picture winner Kramer vs. Kramer. Moving forward, script duties would fall on franchise stalwarts David and Leslie Newman, penning a script which Donner disliked and Christopher Reeve continued to find too campy, making it known that he wanted to sit this entry out. That one subplot was later used and referenced in Office Space should tell you the tone here. The studio reportedly considered a full replacement for Reeve, with names like Jeff Bridges, John Travolta, Kurt Russell, and Tony Danza all linked at one point to the role. However, it should be noted that producer Pierre Spengler called the Danza rumor, quote, bullshit. Moving into director duties would be Richard Lester, who famously, or maybe infamously, took over from Richard Donner on Superman 2. But that's an entirely different episode of What the Fuck Happened to This Movie. Just to remind you of Lester's style, he was really best known for lighter fare like the Beatles' A Hard Day's Night and Help, as well as the 3 and 4 Musketeers. Christopher Reeve would of course return as Clark Kent, aka Superman. A spoiler alert, by the way, while Jackie Cooper and Mark McClure would also reprise Daily Planet editor Perry White and photojournalist Jimmy Olsen, respectively. And there was Margot Kidder as Lois Lane, for a few minutes anyway. Things were so chaotic making Superman 2 that key cast members such as Kidder couldn't help themselves but be outspoken about the behind-the-scenes drama. Lex Luthor himself, Gene Hackman, was also rumored to have been rather vocal, but he later debunked this, which is easy enough to believe since he came back for Superman 4. But Kidder and Lois Lane would straight up be written out, other than a brief appearance, reportedly being on set for just 5 days. But those behind the scenes also defended her lack of screen time by saying they just didn't have much more for Lois Lane to do. And so they shipped her off to Hong Kong, something mentioned in the very first sentence of Salkin's outline, showing just how much they wanted Margot Kidder out. Instead, we got Annette O'Toole as childhood friend Lana Lang, who was actually first introduced in the original Superman. We also have Robert Vaughn as Ross Bubba Webster, a role that Alan Alda was reportedly the top choice for, with Frank Langella also being considered. Langella would get his spot in the franchise as Perry White in Superman Returns.
Before we continue with our video, here's a reminder to click the Store tab on any of our Joblo channels and browse our collection of the latest and freshest designs in our merch store. Go get you some.
Taking the lead antagonist spot from Lex Luthor, Webster is this sort of guy mixed up with supercomputers and missiles and, yeah, cyborgs. You know, the usual supervillain stuff. There too is Annie Ross as his sister Vera, who is turned into the aforementioned cyborg in a truly haunting sequence. But we have yet to hit on the star of Superman 3, and if you're thinking you already covered Christopher Reeve, then you're mistaken as to who the real lead of the threequel is. Enter Richard Pryor as Gus Gorman. By this point, Pryor had a successful movie career with flicks like Stir Crazy and The Toy. Naturally, he provided much of the movie's comedic relief, or at least the intentional kind. Already a successful presence on the stage and screen, Pryor went so far as to declare his love for Superman on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, which gave producers the idea to cast him in the crucial role. But so much attention and screen time was given to Gus that it feels less like a Superman movie than a Richard Pryor comedy, and that stands as one of the biggest problems with Superman 3. Oddly though, Pryor was hardly featured on any tie-in merchandise, which some have perceived as racism on the part of the studio. Christopher Reeve fared much better despite feeling like a supporting player, landing top billing for the first time in the series, as he was previously outshined by Gene Hackman and Marlon Brando. Wasn't it bad enough he was already making $3.7 million for 12 days of work? On the truly supporting role front, versed viewers will notice Aaron Smolinski, who played baby Clark Kent in the 1978 original, in the opening sequence. Frank Oz also originally had a cameo, but this was cut, only later used in the extended TV version. More on that shortly. Filming on Superman 3 began on June 21st, 1982, more than 2 years after it was first advertised at the Cannes Film Festival. Locations included London's famed Pinewood Studios, with other various locales as diverse as Calgary and Utah. As for the coal mine sequence, that was shot at Battersea Power Station, which you might recognize from the cover of Pink Floyd's Animals album. And no, the sequence where evil Superman is being a bit of a dick was not actually shot at the Leaning Tower of Pisa. That was merely a special effect. Speaking of visual effects, video game pioneers Atari actually did the effects for the scene in which a computer is used to shoot missiles at a flying Superman, even using a 35mm film recorder, a major meshing of mediums for the time. And okay, it looks lousy 40 plus years later, but it still looks a hell of a lot better than that god-awful Nintendo 64 game. On the music front, Ken Thorne is credited, using part of John Williams' original iconic score as a launching point, although he did create his own numbers from scratch as well. Giorgio Moroder, then known for his American Gigolo and Cat People scores, made minimal contributions on the song front, but of course brought his trademark synth sounds. The bulk of his work can be heard on side B of the soundtrack. Superman 3 would be released on June 17, 1983, opening at number 1 with $13.4 million, finally bumping Return of the Jedi from the top spot after 3 weeks. During its run, it would pull in $60 million domestically, which wasn't quite enough to put it in the top 10 highest grossing movies of the year, coming in at number 11 just behind National Lampoon's Vacation. It would take in another $20 million internationally, which would put it at number 8 worldwide. Compare that to the first Superman with a take of $134 million, and the first sequel with its own $108 million, and you're looking at a super dud. But it wasn't just the box office numbers that made it a disappointment, it was the quality of the movie itself. As Spengler put it, the sequel was not as successful as the first or the second, probably because of us trying to be too smart and not delivering to the audience basically the same movie as the first two. It's something which we've analyzed since. If you look at a series like Rocky, you've got 5 times the same movie, and the audience is happy with that. Christopher Reeve himself disliked the movie, calling it, quote, the Harvard Lampoon version of the Superman movies. To give you an idea of what he means, the script originally had a moment where Superman mistakes Telly Savalas, as Kojak no less, for Lex Luthor. Richard Pryor said, "For a piece of shit, it smells great," no doubt referring to his $5 million payday. Pryor would also land one of the movie's 2 Razzie nominations for Worst Supporting Actor, losing to Jim Nabors in Stroker Ace. The other would be for Worst Score, credited to Moroder. Like the first 2 Superman movies, Superman 3 had its own TV version, this one clocking in close to 20 minutes longer. There are a handful of cut scenes and shots, but the only true improvement here was an updated opening credit sequence that mimicked the first 2 movies instead of the obtrusive version in the original, which blocked portions of the on-screen action. Even still, one of the most criticized elements of the movie remained. Martha Kent's death was still an afterthought. Believe it or not, Batman vs. Superman ended up having the right idea. Save Martha. More than 4 decades on, Superman 3 holds a 29% on Rotten Tomatoes, well below the original's 94% and Superman 2's 83%. But it is at least quite a bit better than the Quest for Pieces score, which rests at 10%.
It's wonderful mushroom sauce with champagne, and in case we got hungry afterwards. I mean later.
You shouldn't have gone to all that trouble.
But at least Superman 3 had the brain to not tease the next installment like its predecessors did. After all, who really wanted Superman 4? Wonder what the f happened to that movie?